Hi, everyone. I see we've got a few people. Should we give a second to get started? I'll introduce myself. My name's Amy Goldman. I am the Director of Legal Services at Community Legal Aid SoCal, and I will pass it over to my colleague.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. We're really excited about this topic and really happy to have you here. My name is Sarah Reisman. I'm the Directing Attorney of Advocacy and Litigation, also at CLA SoCal.
Go to the next slide.
So for a brief overview of what we are going to talk about today, I think the too long didn't read version of this presentation is why you get your best ideas in the shower and why they really are your best ideas. So we'll start with some disclaimers, and then we will be talking about identifying vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue, your brain on stress, and then your brain's ability to recover and repair itself. And then we'll go into some strategies for how to implement this on your own. For whatever reason, my slides are really small. Let me see if I can make them just a little bit bigger. And the last thing we'll do, I couldn't read. We will talk about the benefits of soft fascination and low mental bandwidth. And finally, we'll talk about tools for recovery and resilience.
All right, next. So it's my job to sort of go over those disclaimers. So obviously, we are not the experts in the mental health field, but we're going to share some things that we've learned. So we also want to say that while talking about soft fascination and some of the mindfulness tools that you can use to address burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, they aren't necessarily intended to be responsive or actually fix the issue if you are experiencing heightened levels of anxiety or stress or possibly secondary post-traumatic stress. And we really encourage people to seek out professional assistance if that is something they need. But at the same time, we're hoping that this presentation might give some help with identifying symptoms, sort of understanding what's going on with your brain and your body, and then incorporating tools in your daily life that hopefully would head off having more of these sort of chronic long-term conditions. So like I said before, we're not experts. This is something we presented on about a year and a half ago. We haven't found much additional research, but we've continued to apply these tools in our lives, and we thought it would be helpful to share it again. And so since we don't have the specialized expertise, we really encourage you all to engage, put questions into the chat at any time during the presentation, and hope we can have, as best as we can do in the Zoom center to be able to have a dialogue. And then lastly, I would say, while this is a presentation about why you get your best ideas in the shower, I think it's also shameless propaganda for quitting that doom scrolling, because when you think you need some rest and relaxation and to check out, that is often many of us, including myself, will go to. And this kind of gives you this foundation of why there are a lot better options.
All right, next slide, please, Megan. So because we are in the legal profession, we are going to start with some definitions. We're going to be talking about three different terms: compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and burnout. These conditions can all range in severity depending on the individual and the specific circumstances. People often talk about them as if they're interchangeable. They're not quite, but they're conceptually really similar. So compassion fatigue is the physical and emotional erosion that takes place when helpers are unable to refuel and regenerate. It diminishes our ability to feel empathy for our clients, for our loved ones, and our coworkers. And it's also why you want to catch your judicial officer at the beginning of the calendar call as opposed to at the end. Vicarious trauma is a profound shift in worldview that is the result of repeated exposure to others' trauma. So extreme forms of vicarious trauma can develop into PTSD symptoms. So as if you yourself experience the same trauma that you've heard about. Burnout is something that can happen to anybody in any profession or at any stage of their life. It's the state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that's caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It doesn't necessarily coincide with a changed worldview or a decrease in empathy. So helpers in particular can simultaneously experience compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. Both compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are cumulative over time and are occupational hazards of doing the work that we do. Burnout can be more easily resolved, changing jobs, taking long vacation, and using some of the tools that we'll be discussing today. They can provide some immediate relief for anybody suffering from job-related burnout. But that's not necessarily the case for compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, which can in fact alter the brain. As somebody in the helping profession, as we all are, the distinctions described here might not be super important because they might all feel the same for us, but we go over these so that we can start to understand how each of them operate differently on the brain and how, depending on the severity of each one might need different interventions. And hopefully at the end of this presentation, you will have some strategies that you can implement in your day-to-day life that will decrease some of these things that you might be feeling.
We can go to the next slide. So Sarah and I have presented multiple times on trauma-informed learning, vicarious trauma, and she always sticks me with the slide talking about the brain because somehow I'm more comfortable saying things like amygdala. But really, I think it's so helpful to talk about how trauma really impacts the brain, how vicarious trauma can have these impacts, how our brain and our bodies actually can change based on these experiences. So just to, again, remind us of why we have so much compassion for our clients, and to sort of divert some of that compassion back to yourself, we want to talk about what this looks like in the brain. So when there is a threat, and this is real or perceived, this is so important because for someone who is experiencing post-traumatic stress, if there is a perceived threat, the brain is doing the same thing as whether there is a full-blown real threat. Our oldest part of the brain, the reptilian part of our brain, fires up, that's the amygdala, and it actually reacts instantaneously to try to protect you from danger. And that's when, your adrenaline starts flowing and your heartbeat quickens, your blood pressure increases, you start sweating, and all the blood is going not to your brain, but to your extremities to get you out of that situation if you need it. And all these non-essential functions like, higher brain functioning are sort of put on shutdown to keep you in that survival. And then this is when we engage in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn to just protect us immediately from the danger. So when animals are exposed to that kind of danger, that kind of trauma, when they're done, they often, and you'll actually see it in those great nature videos, they have that like full body shake through their body. And that actually sort of resets not just the body, but the brain. It slows down that amygdala again and recalibrates. People can do it too. Have you ever seen like after a stressful situation, you're just like, let it out. It's actually really good for you to just get that physical release. But we don't always have the opportunity to shake it out. And sometimes there can be just trauma after trauma. Thinking about when you're doing intakes with clients over and over, you're hearing these really difficult experiences. And so there is going to be some long-term impacts on our brain. And it actually reduces our prefrontal cortex. That's our sort of thinking and our cognitive reasoning part of our brain. and it blows up our amygdala, because if we're constantly exposed to trauma or what's perceived as danger, our brain is adapting. And so that safety trigger, the amygdala, is doing something different because it needs to be constantly engaged. And that's where we get that conversation about triggers. So, and not that sort of colloquial, oh yeah, I'm triggered when I smell McDonald's because I don't like it, something like that. No, a trigger actually is talking about connecting back to the trauma, and then those who have experienced very extreme trauma and are experiencing post-traumatic stress are going to end up not just being triggered because they don't like something, but actually reliving. So like I said, we talked about what's going on in the body, but what's also happening is that as our body is in this major stress situation, this danger, the brain is going to be working differently too. So we actually store memories differently in times of very heightened stress or in trauma. And so I think for some of us who have talked to clients who we need to sort of get details about a situation that's very traumatic, our clients don't necessarily tell us a linear story because their brain and their body have not stored it in a way that a memory would be stored without the trauma. And so because that amygdala was firing up, the hippocampus, that's the part that holds our memory, is actually sort of lower functioning, and it doesn't store those memories in an easy to access way. And that's when people are triggered by smell, by a location, by something they hear, because the memories are sort of more ingrained in their whole self rather than just in the easy to access hippocampus with those straightforward memories. So I know we're going sort of way deep into this trauma in the brain and stress in the brain, but it's so important to think about how these really difficult situations impacts not just how we feel in the day or whether we're having trouble sleeping, but actually how our brain and our body engages in the world. Because if you've experienced either vicariously or directly a major trauma, that means that your body or your brain can sort of go into this overdrive at times if you're triggered by an experience and you're connected back to that trauma or that danger. But luckily, the brain is something that constantly is changing and that can be, reformed and reconnected in different ways. So I'm going to pass it to Sarah to sort of talk about, okay, we've got all the stuff that's happening based on trauma, but what else can we do once we have had that change in our brain, that damage to ourselves from the trauma?
Yeah, next slide, please. So the traumatized brain, either, as Amy said, from vicarious trauma or actual trauma, is a damaged brain. So there are actually changes in the neurons, the amygdala, and we have now been doing this presentation for long enough that I can say the word amygdala. I feel like it's a really exciting point in my life. The amygdala actually grows, and the prefrontal cortex can shrink, the hippocampus can shrink, and that has, and those don't necessarily change back unless there's some sort of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis happening. Now, this is the really exciting thing and shows how magic our brains are, that they can actually repair themselves. So even if somebody has been exposed to repeated trauma, the brain can start to repair itself. There are ways to reverse damage caused by chronic stress, burnout, and vicarious trauma. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to form new connections and pathways and change how its circuits are wired. Neurogenesis, it's even cooler. It's the ability of the brain to form new neurons. So neuroplasticity is the thing that allows us to keep learning new languages, new skills, new coping mechanisms. Neurogenesis is the thing that allows the brain to heal itself. So science, and I will say that very generally because neither Amy nor I are scientists, but science believes that there's only two regions of the brain that can continue to develop new neurons when somebody is an adult. One is the cerebrium, which is the coordination and muscle memory hub. So in fact, you can teach a old dog new tricks. And the other part is, I can't tell if anybody laughs at my jokes. I say these jokes for myself, but I hope that there is somewhere out there in internet land where people are laughing at my jokes or groaning at them, depending on how terrible they are. Thank you for the laughing emojis. I appreciate them. So the other region of the brain that can form new neurons is the hippocampus, and that is long-term and spatial memory. And so that's why neurogenesis and neuroplasticity are super exciting, because that hippocampus, which is storing the trauma, can repair itself so that these hardwired traumatic events can be repaired. And those fear-based memories that can often lead to traumatic behaviors or avoidance behaviors that can hold a person back from being resilient and finding resiliency after trauma, those can be repaired. I mean, we do this already, some with medications, with well-trained therapists, and that's really great. But hopefully, and what we'll turn to in a moment, is that we can make permanent and significant changes to our brain structure through simple activities that we can do in a normal day. And I think we're ready for the next slide. All right, so I will let Amy introduce this one while I get stuff ready to put in the chat.
Okay, so we're going to get to the meat of why we're putting this all in the chat, but we're asking you all to take just 3 minutes. You already decided to spend an hour with us. Take 3 minutes to find a option, choose one of the options that Sarah's putting in the chat for relaxation, for just sort of stepping back. So you can choose the guided meditation, a stretch break. We've got some Lizzo for the dance break, or sitting in silence, something I'm obviously not very good at, talking to you all. Maybe looking at a poem or going outside. So we're just gonna set a timer for 3 minutes, and please take this time. I'm asking just for once, don't check your email for these 3 minutes. Check your email while we're talking, or don't. But more importantly, actually take these 3 minutes, and then we'll come back to you and then talk about why these activities are actually helping with that neuroplasticity and the neurogenesis.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your 3 minutes. While I continue to talk, please put which break you put or which break you used in the chat. We'd love to see either which of our suggestions you took or what super interesting suggestions you had on your own. And Megan, can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, Cheryl, of course you did. Cheryl did a dance break. I'm loving seeing all these. Thank you so much. All right. So now let's move into what we can do. We know that trauma can hurt the brain. We know that we have the ability to heal our brain. So how do we do that? I feel like we hear what we are supposed to do all of the time. We're supposed to exercise, we're supposed to sleep, we're supposed to eat well. Meditate is the one that I always hear, but cannot for the life of me bring myself to do. We're supposed to create boundaries, and we're supposed to find a supportive community. These are all really big, non-specific goals that can feel really, really overwhelming, especially when you are already combating vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, or any sort of burnout. The goal of this presentation is to explain why those macro strategies are effective, but also to provide some micro strategies that don't feel as much of a heavy lift. Hopefully, you'll come away with a couple of small ideas that, if done often, become habits that can lead to better results. Next slide.
All right, so downtime. Can I get a smiley face for people who feel like they don't give themselves enough downtime right now? Okay. It is really important that we have downtime because it's going to do that replenish and the stores of attention and motivation we have. But here's the interesting thing. So 100 years ago, and we use science generally because that's where we are. So 100 years ago, science would have said that the brain's not productive when it's at rest. And if you're not focused on doing, then your brain's offline. So, but now, of course, we know that the brain is really active when it's resting. Think about even when people are sleeping and relaxing, it can still be moving. And so actual resting and resting your brain is something that is essential. So downtime, like we said, it's going to replenish the brain stores to get you encouraged for productivity, creativity. This is getting to Sarah's point of best ideas in the shower. And it's really essential to both achieve our highest levels of performance, to really be able to go and do, and also to form stable memories, to engage in everyday life, to have a balance, and to allow our mind not to be doing a million things and going in a million directions at the same time, because when we have that wandering mind, we don't necessarily engage in the present. So moments of respite, they're actually necessary to keep us really engaged and to help us follow that work that we love, that we do, that if we don't give ourselves the rest, we'll just end up with us feeling the compassion fatigue, the burnout, and really impacted by that vicarious trauma and stress. So downtime is the opportunity for the brain to just make sense of what's recently learned, to surface like unresolved ideas, to make connections, to really reflect on the external world. I mean, if anybody spent time with young kids, you often see that this is happening for small children. You know, they're absorbing, and then it's really not until that next day, having that sleep and that rest and that time of just staring up at the mobile or whatever it is, that they're actually able to share that information again, to apply it, because their brain has had the opportunity to rest and sort of reconfigure and put everything together. So science really states that there are kind of 5 different kinds of resting states. One is sort of called the default, and I'm reading this because it gets a little complicated. So the default mode network, and that's sort of the more active part. And then there is also the more, as you move forward, the more sort of active stages of the brain where you're getting into problem solving and complex thought. And to be able to do that, you really have to go to the rest. So when we talk about the macro rest, that's that vacation that I hope you all are taking, that you're taking away, you're moving from the things that cause that stress and the anxiety and the fatigue, and you are engaging in these positive and restful activities. But the micro rest, which is so important, is just that daydream, just sort of letting go of paying attention to everything around you and being in that daydream state. I don't know if anybody has other examples of what they do when they're just take that micro moment. I think in the chat, I saw people talked about silence and breathing, going outside. What are those micro moments? And I think we'll get to some more examples of that, but I'll pass it over to Sarah to actually talk about this idea of the different stages that you can engage in rest that are most healthy for our brains.
Yeah, next slide, please. Oh, did we lose Megan? Oh, no, there we go. All right. Some more definitions and some more concepts. But basically, now that we know that your brain needs rest to process all of the data and inputs and make sense of it, what should that rest look like? I think many of us, myself included, reach for our phones when we need a break, or after a long day of work, all we want to do is sit and binge TV. But studies suggest that those type of behaviors might not be restorative because they take so much attention and focus. It doesn't allow our brains to get to that restive state, and instead the brain stays active. So even though we are tempted, and I am guilty of this myself all of the time, I see you, Law and Order, watching TV at the end of a long day might not actually be the most restive things that we can do. All right, so a few more concepts. Directed attention. It is what it sounds like. It's things that require major effort to block out competing or peripheral thoughts and stimuli. For example, carrying out important tasks despite diversions, listening closely when there's noise in the background, or feeling compassion for others when we ourselves still have unmet needs. In other words, most of the day-to-day of doing our jobs. We only have a finite amount of directed attention. In contrast to directed attention, there's fascination. Fascination is involuntary attention. It just innately holds our interests. Things that fascinate us don't fatigue us because we are just naturally at the edge of our seat, interested, engaged. And some examples of fascination, some of them are probably obvious, but I really liked this list. It's strange things, moving things, wild animals, bright things, pretty things, blows, and blood. We have infinite attention for fascinating things. So often in our life, work requires directed attention, especially for those of us in the legal profession. We have to do legal research. We have to meet and interact with clients who are experiencing trauma. We have to deal with adverse parties, judges, lawyers, people who are oppositional. And we sometimes just live in a world that feels really hostile to who we are, what we are trying to do, and the people who we care about. But we only have a finite amount of that directed attention. So if we don't get the restorative attention, and if we don't find things that fascinate us, we don't have the ability to start to repair our brains. But here's the trick. Not all things that fascinate us are restorative. There are two kinds of fascinations. Actually, I'm sure there are many kinds of fascinations. I know of two, and I'm going to talk about two today. One is hard fascination, and the other is soft fascination. Hard fascination is anything that holds our full attention. It's a TV show. It's a sporting event. But because it takes up so much of our mental effort, because we are literally on the edge of our seat, our brain doesn't have any room to relax and to daydream and to get to that restive state. Hard fascination might be more entertaining and therefore more appealing when we want to unwind, but it doesn't actually always help us get to that restive state. So instead, studies suggest that we need something called soft fascination. Those are things that hold our attention while leaving sufficient energy for our brain to kind of daydream and do other things. The most common example of soft fascination is nature. And there have been several studies that study the connection between nature and the benefits associated of being in the natural world and our brain's ability to relax and restore itself. And great news for those of us who live in urban areas, pictures of nature are found to be effective as well, which is why we have a ton of nature pictures on this. Hopefully we are sneaking in some soft fascination. Well, maybe a lot of soft fascination for those of you who have like tuned out all of the science and are just enjoying these beautiful nature pictures. Fine by us. It means that you're getting the benefits of this presentation sneakily without you even noticing it. All right. So next I'm going to turn it back over to Amy to talk about different kinds of soft fascination.
All right, so I think are we on the next slide or? Yes. Okay, so charts are sometimes helpful to sort of see where we are on this attention, scheme. And so some things that require directed attention do still have restorative potential, but they don't take as much directed attention or effort. So we have a couple examples which I think are really helpful to understand. So if we're talking about something that takes directed attention but doesn't require as much bandwidth, it's something that gives you a little bit of that soft focus, but still is going to require that focus brain power. And learning to knit is a great example because we have the process of learning and then the actual knitting. So when you're learning to knit, you actually takes a lot of directed attention. You've got to learn how to do it. You're figuring out what is the process for actually making the product. But once you learn to knit, I don't know if we have any knitters in the room, it becomes just sort of this low attention activity where you're just sort of doing and going and your hands are moving and your brain is daydreaming. I know we keep going back to that same theme of the daydream because when we're not focused and our brain just sort of moves in its own direction, when we're not sort of holding those thoughts and working on the brief or interviewing clients, that's when our brain is getting that chance to put everything together and slow it down. So once you actually are doing the knitting, that is where you get to that low attention and less mental bandwidth. So another example of sort of, I think one of my favorite soft fascination is walking in nature or going on a hike, because your body is just sort of trudging and going along. And if you don't have the audiobook or the music in your ears, you're not necessarily talking to someone who's with you, your brain is just slowing down and taking in all the beauty of nature and actually being pulled in those moments of fascination. So obviously we want to avoid that bottom line activities. So for work, you got to draft the brief, but the internet scrolling, the using your phone as a way to sort of check out and slow down, it's not going to do for your brain what you need, because, you know, same with watching television, it's going to require sort of little attentional effort, but it's often going to get a big amount of space in your head, especially if you're watching something that maybe is cliffhangers or there's a mystery, or you're sort of getting involved into the story and reducing your feelings of sort of self-awareness and restoration. And although there's just really limited research on the cognitive demands connected to that other high attention activity, the smartphones, there is evidence to say that use of smartphones can actually lead to acute, I love this quote, acute declines in attentional functioning. Not surprising, because if we're so used to just scrolling and doing our thing, that sort of general attention, we really reduce our ability to engage in the world that way. So what we want to do is find activities that work for us individually that really are putting us in this soft fascination, the low attentional effort. And we're not talking about, zoning out when your significant other is talking to you. That might be helpful, but really instead finding opportunities where you can both have that moment of zoning out and also have positive things around you, like nature or music, some sort of, as Sarah read in the list, some sort of pretty things.
All right, so now comes the participatory portion of the presentation. That was a lot of P's. We've included a couple of ideas here. We've talked about a couple of ideas. I'd really just love to pull the expertise in this webinar to hear what your ideas are and what some of the things that you might already be doing. It's funny, we gave this presentation 1.5 years ago, and for a long time, I was really good at taking a break to go for a walk around the block. I was, sometimes I put on a YouTube video of nature and just have it running when I do my work, so I can take micro breaks and just go over and look at it. But over time, those things, I kind of fell out of the habit of doing it. So it's really nice for me to redo this presentation so I can start to rethink about some of those habits that I had and start to re-engage with them. All right, I saw one chat. Lauren Hansen asked, excellent question, Lauren. Where does reading a book for leisure fall in terms of hard or soft fascination? With 0 studies to back this up, my guess would be it falls a little bit more on hard fascination. And that doesn't mean we can't do things that are hard fascinating, because reading a book can be really relaxing. But what it doesn't do is allow our brain to daydream and wander. And so we're focusing on the book, we're focusing on the story, we're focusing on the language. And so our brain isn't going to that restive state. I will not take your books away from you, Lauren, I promise. I think that reading is one of the joys in life. But if we really do need to have if we're at a place where we need restoration, we need to do something that allows that we can do while our brain wanders. Any other suggestions or things that y'all are doing already that might have effortless attention and be a soft fascination activity?
So Nikki said, and during law school, I relied on crafting during the most stressful times, little projects like painting and decorating things, tchotchkes and boxes, pots, general. So yeah, that sort of giving your brain that space of thinking while you're engaging in a often like a physical activity. Oh, decorating for the holidays.
Sitting on my porch and listening to the rain or bird songs, gold star. That's what science says is one of the most restorative, soft fascination things we can do. Paint by numbers, plants, putting on a YouTube fire log with soothing music. Yes, Erica, done that one myself before.
So Barbara, in the baking the cupcakes, have you got that recipe down? You don't even have to think about it, because that's a wonderfully sort of fun activity. But if we're still following that recipe and I cannot make cupcakes by heart, then we're engaging in that hard fascination. But if you've got that cupcakes, like I have my banana bread recipe, I don't even think about it when I'm doing it, and I'm just kind of going. I'm not even measuring at this point. That's that soft fascination where my brain is sort of doing something separate from my body.
Picking avocados. Yes, please. A lot of art, a lot of listening to music, cooking, going for a walk. Yeah, I think these are all wonderful examples. I was joking to Amy that sometimes even washing the dishes does it for me, like especially on a cold day with hot water. But then of course I just only soft fascination until it gets to the point where I get annoyed that it's me doing it and not my husband. And then all the good work is just dissolves. Thank you, Bridget. Yes.
Yeah, and watching birds at the hummingbird feeder, I love those because it's kind of magical just watching them move. So doing all this is important. Finding these individual ways in which you can slow down, take that restorative break, and give yourself some repair, the neuroplasticity, the neurogenesis, so that you can continue to do the hard work. But this really shouldn't just be on you as an individual. So if you want to go to the next slide, we also need to have our organizations and our managers support this kind of activity to really model the best practices and encourage our teammates to do the same. So on that micro level, that means that managers should be taking vacations and showing that example, and also encouraging and checking in with staff to say, do you have plans to take time off? When are you going to take time off? It's important to take time off. And still in sort of those bigger things is and acting as examples is taking lunch breaks. I know a lot of us don't take lunch breaks, but taking that break away is really valuable. So that's one way to sort of say, hey, on a big picture, we take time away from work and we value taking time away from work. The other thing that we can do as managers is to say, respect the boundaries of work time. If there is not an emergency, then we all need to know how to use the deliver later function of our emails. We need to make that space so that there isn't this constant inundation from managers, from supervisors after work hours with expectations of people to continue to work. So that's sort of about taking the break time. But the other piece is we also want to make sure that wellness is part of checking in with staff, discussing what are people doing to rest, what space are we creating, and also making sure that when someone chooses to take a rest, that vacation or that break, that it doesn't just mean that work is piling up for the week or hopefully 2 weeks that someone takes away from work. And to make things easier, and this is just one of those general things that we should all be doing as managers, is celebrating success. This is hard work, and we have big successes. We, get published appeals, but we also have small successes where we got a great settlement for a client, where we were able to develop new partnerships so that our clients are able to engage in systems more positively. There's so many ways to identify success, but we need to recognize them, celebrate them, and encourage them. Like I said earlier, respecting those boundaries, not expecting that work is something that is happening at all times. It's so important to know that people really need a balance of work and rest to be able to do their best work. And then, of course, making time for community and collaboration in an organization. And we found at Community Legal Aid, we are able to do this even in our remote world. We do get together physically from time to time, but even just making those small connections virtually, engaging with our colleagues, not just on the rote activities of work, but actually the human connections and that opportunity to collaborate and work together on projects so people aren't working in a vacuum. Because although this presentation is not about some of the other restorative practices that we can engage in to heal from trauma and stress and burnout, one of the other biggest things we can do is have positive relationships in our lives. So the more we can make space for positive relationships, the more that we are able to actually heal from trauma and those of you who have seen Sarah and I before, I'll get on my soapbox and really recommend the new Oprah book called What Happened to You. And there's a really amazing example about how younger children, as they age, were more likely to heal depending on what kind of stable and positive relationships they had in their life, even if they had experienced really massive and difficult trauma. And that's true for us as adults too, to have these positive, supportive relationships in our lives, both professionally and personally, really allows us to get that restorative time that we need and that ability to continue to do this hard work. So I saw that there was a raised hand. I think, Megan, are you able to unmute? Was it Irina?
I think it was Irina, yes. Let me go ahead and allow to
Let's see if
talk.
we can figure out how to do this. Okay. Irina. Oh, it's by accident. Oh, we put you on the spot. Sorry.
Oops.
We welcome the enthusiasm even without having to say anything. So, but just getting back to the idea that if you are a manager, it is part of your job to support your staff, to find ways that they can rest and engage in restorative practices so that they can continue to do this really hard work.
We were going to go to a breakout session next so that you all could build a little bit of community and talk about what restorative activities are right for you. But we can't with this form of presentation, no breakout rooms. So instead, if there are any others restorative activities that people want to put in the chat, there was some really, really great ones. So please don't feel any pressure to do more. We have one slide after this, which is basically, a slide about final questions. So if there are no more comments, we can end early and you can take 15 minutes. Oh, yes, Megan, that would be lovely. Megan's going to allow everybody to talk, hopefully not at once. But if there's anything that you want to share about your favorite restorative activity or ask a question of us, now's a great time. Otherwise, we can give you some time back to do something restorative. And, since you're still within the blocked out time of this presentation, you can really just take advantage of that.
Absolutely.
Amy's better at sitting in silence than I am. It's real hard for me.
Well, I think what I'm hearing is that you all can definitely benefit from taking some time because you're here, you're doing hard work. And now Emily's raised her hand and she's going to unmute herself and it'll be great to hear.
Hi, hello from Boston. Thank you all.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. Thank you. First off, I want to thank you so much for putting this on for us. It's really been very enlightening. So kind of specific, but I think we can all understand that, especially as litigators, that we can have some really toxic interactions with opposing parties and opposing counsels that really go out of their way to bully us. And sometimes I kind of want to vent about that with coworkers, but then I feel guilty because I don't want to come across as unprofessional or weak. And I would really love to know your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and Amy and I are fortunate enough to work together. She's my boss. And we've been doing a version of this presentation even before when we were colleagues. So I think the one thing is to find a confidant. So this is outside the scope of this presentation, but there are mentors, there are confidants, and there are advocates in our professional lives, and they're all a little bit different. So identify who your confidants are and share with them. It could be a colleague who you're particularly close to. It could be, for me, it was Amy when we were at different organizations, because that felt a little bit safer. So that's what I would do as a colleague. And I'll just, celebrate Amy a little bit here, in that I'm fortunate to work at an organization that normalizes these kind of conversations, that talks about the impact of the work. And so it feels at our organization, and there are several of us from my organization on this call, so I'm sure that they can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we have normalized the ability to have these conversations. And there is no weakness, there is no shame. It is, we just gave you the science of how real it is and how damaging it is. So it's not about being weak, it's impacting your brain and developing the tools so that you can continue to do the amazing work that you do long-term.
Yeah, and thank you, Sarah, for your kind words. And it's definitely having people who you respect and trust in the profession is so important. The other thing that I found helpful for me, Emily, is when I'm having that really hard time and I've engaged in something that felt traumatic, that was stressful, that was overwhelming. I asked the person if they have space. I had this really stressful conversation. Do you have time or space to talk about it? And then also, as the person who is asked, I feel that it's okay to say no, and that's important too. And also, when I say yes, the question that I ask is, what are you looking for? Do you want me to just listen, or do you want to talk about problem solving? And I think those are two ways to sort of open that space. So, and there's more hands raised, but I can't figure it out. We have Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Hi, this is Dave. I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. Usually what I'll do is, if I've had a long day, I'll take my lunch, instead of, during midday, I take it near the end of the day, get off an extra hour early. And I've got a friend who's retired, and we go out and play tennis. And we just bat the ball around. And I've been playing tennis for many years, so it's more relaxing for me. And when I have that slam that gets in there, it feels really good. On the flip side, when I'm managing folks, if they're stressed out and there's something going on, I know that there's an intention, it's like, you need to take a walk. And sometimes, they want to talk things out. So we'll leave the building and go out in one of the mini paths we have here and just take a walk, and I'll just shut up and just let them talk, and then get it out. And then if they want something fixed or they want something answered, well, then I'll answer it. But they like that.
I like that example of going out for a walk. That's wonderful. Thank you, Dave.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. And Nikki, you have your hand up as well.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning how important it is to ask somebody if they have the capacity to hear something that might be difficult or traumatic. And I want to throw my hat in the ring to challenge people to say no even when they weren't asked. I think one of the hardest things I ever did on one of our calls in early COVID was to mute my speakers and just announce, I'm muting. This story is entirely too hard for me to hear. Will somebody please chat me when it's over? And I was like, I'm going to get in trouble at first. But then all I got was, cool, thanks for taking care of yourself. We're done. So I just want to encourage that probably sort of courageous thing to tell somebody, even if they've just jumped in, I don't have room right now. I'm so sorry. Actually, not sorry. I just don't have room right now.
Absolutely, Nikki. I think that's something that is really important for us to recognize to empower dynamics in our work relationships, that we should do everything we can to recognize the inherent power of each of our colleagues and not engage in that top-down sort of approaches to the relationship. So anybody has the ability to say no if it's a conversation that is not appropriate or one they don't want to engage in at that time. So yeah, we moved into a totally other direction, but I think it gets back to the same point, is that we all need a lot of supports to do this work. And the support can come from ourselves internally. The support can come from our personal and professional networks, and the support also must come from the organizations in which we do this work. So tapping into all of those is important for hopefully having a career in legal services. I know I feel very thankful that have the ability to do this work. Did we lose Sarah?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, I'm like, you can tell on the screen.
Oh,
Okay.
I was just listening and enjoying the conversation and everybody's comments. Yeah, I am grateful that I get to do this work at a community like this one. I think it would be very different in a different community. And I'm seeing
Lots of helpful comments.
yes.
Core business hours. No meetings scheduled outside those core hours. I like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Any
Yes.
other thoughts? Sage advice,
Mhm.
always welcome.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been really interactive. Even given that we don't see you guys and we couldn't do breakouts. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.